Daniel Everett sat in his office, staring at a stack of customer complaints on his desk. The reports were troubling long wait times, rude employees, and staff shortages at multiple locations. He had bought the restaurant chain 7 years ago, turning it into a profitable business, but lately, something felt off. He rubbed his temples. His district manager, Craig, had assured him everything was under control, but Daniel wasn't convinced. Every time he asked about the stores, he got the same response. "We're handling it." But handling it how? Daniel wasn't the kind of CEO who just sat back and let others run his company blindly. When he bought the chain, he had worked in the kitchens, learned the recipes, and met employees. But as the company grew, he had become more distant from the day-to-day operations. That needed to change. He decided he would go undercover as a new trainee. He'd visit all 6 locations in the district, starting with the one that had the most complaints. He wanted to see for himself what was really happening. A week later, Daniel stood in front of the restaurant, dressed in a plain black t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap. His beard was a little longer than usual, and he wore thick, rimmed glasses. He had never personally met the staff at this location. Craig handled all hiring and training. To them, he was just Danny, the new guy. When he stepped inside, the first thing he noticed was the tension. The kitchen was chaotic, the front counter understaffed, and the few employees working looked exhausted. "Hey, you must be the new trainee," a tall man with dark circles under his eyes said. He barely looked up from the register. "I'm Josh, the shift manager." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, that's me." "First day," Josh sighed. "All right, we're short-staffed, so I don't have time for a full training session. Just watch and try to keep up." Daniel quickly realized that short-staffed was an understatement. There were only 3 employees running the entire place during the lunch rush. Orders piled up, customers grew impatient, and Josh was snapping at everyone. "Move faster, Emily," he barked at a teenage girl working the fryer. "We're drowning here." "I'm trying," she said, voice strained. Sweat dripped down her face as she rushed to keep up. Daniel watched as Emily worked at a frantic pace, barely catching her breath between orders. She looked exhausted, and it was clear she had been working nonstop. Then, another employee, a boy who couldn't have been older than 16, leaned against the counter, rubbing his temples. "Man, I've been here since 6 this morning. No break, no nothing. This is insane." Josh turned on him. "You don't get to complain, Caleb. We're all working hard. You think I'm not tired too?" Caleb clenched his jaw. "Yeah, but I'm not even supposed to be here this long. You keep calling people off and leaving us with no help." Daniel's stomach tightened. A 16-year-old working since 6 in the morning with no break. That wasn't just bad management, it was illegal. Before Josh could respond, a customer at the front counter slammed her hand down. "Hello." "I've been waiting 20 minutes for my order," Josh groaned. "Emily, where's the food for order 23? Emily looked panicked. I think I messed up the fries. I'll redo them." Josh threw his hands up. "Unbelievable. You kids can't do anything right." Daniel watched as Emily's face fell, her hands shaking as she dumped the fries and started over. That was enough. Daniel turned to Caleb. "You really haven't had a break since 6? Caleb looked at him, surprised that someone was actually listening. "No." "And I asked, but Josh keeps saying we're too busy." Daniel clenched his teeth. This wasn't just a bad day, this was a pattern, and it was clear who was responsible. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay in character. He needed to see more before he blew his cover. But one thing was certain. This wasn't going to continue. Daniel kept moving through the shift, absorbing every detail. The employees were scrambling, their exhaustion evident in the way they carried themselves. Orders were constantly delayed, and tensions rose with each passing minute. He focused on Emily, who was still frantically managing the fryer, and Caleb, who was forcing himself to stay upright despite his clear fatigue. A man walked in from the back office, wearing a manager's uniform. His name tag read, Todd. He had a stiff posture, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the chaos. "What's going on out here?" Todd's voice cut through the noise. Josh turned to him, his frustration boiling over. "We're drowning, Todd. I told you we needed more people, but you keep cutting shifts." Todd barely reacted. "Labor costs are too high, we have to make do with what we have." Daniel watched as Caleb tensed, his hands clenching into fists. "So we just work until we pass out." Caleb's voice was sharp, edged with frustration. Todd's gaze flicked to him. "You're still on the clock, aren't you? If you don't like it, no one's forcing you to stay." Emily glanced up from the fryer, her face pale. "We don't have a choice. If we leave, everything falls apart." Todd crossed his arms. "That's how jobs work. If you can't handle it, maybe this isn't for you." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He had seen bad management before, but this was something else. Todd wasn't just indifferent, he was actively ignoring the signs of burnout in his own team. Caleb exhaled sharply. "I'm supposed to be in school tomorrow. I haven't even eaten since this morning." Todd didn't blink. "Clock out if you need to, but don't expect to get many hours next week if you leave during a rush." Daniel saw Emily freeze, her hands gripping the fryer basket just a little too tight. That was it. He stepped forward, his voice even. "So if someone reaches their breaking point, they just lose hours." Todd turned to him, finally taking notice. "Who are you?" "New trainee," Daniel said smoothly, "just trying to understand how things work around here." Todd's expression didn't change. "It's simple. We run a business, not a daycare. People either do their jobs or they don't." Daniel studied him for a moment. "And if they burn out in the process?" Todd let out a short laugh. "Then they weren't cut out for this industry." Caleb shook his head. "That's messed up." Todd shot him a look. "Watch your tone." Daniel felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. The employees were exhausted, underpaid, and threatened with losing hours if they even considered taking a break. It wasn't just a bad day, it was a toxic system, and it was happening under his watch. He turned to Josh. "How long has it been like this?" Josh hesitated, glancing at Todd. Todd's voice was sharp. "Josh, get back to work." But Daniel didn't let up. "How long?" Josh exhaled, his shoulders stiff. "Since Todd took over the district." Daniel's stomach dropped. Craig had told him everything was running smoothly, but this wasn't smooth, this was barely holding together. Todd straightened, his patience thinning. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're not here to ask questions, you're here to work." Daniel kept his voice calm. "Actually, I think I am here to ask questions." Todd's eyes narrowed. "Oh yeah, and why's that?" Daniel took a breath, then removed his glasses. "Because I own this company." The restaurant went silent. Emily's mouth parted slightly, her hands still gripping the fryer. Caleb blinked in shock. Josh looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Todd's face paled. "What?" Daniel's expression didn't waver. "I'm Daniel Everett Visceral. And I've spent the last several hours watching my employees be overworked, threatened, and mistreated under your leadership." Todd opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Josh for support, but Josh only stared at the floor. Caleb let out a small, breathless laugh. "No way." Emily looked like she was trying to process what had just happened. Daniel turned back to Todd. "You've been cutting shifts to save money, forcing kids to work illegal hours, and threatening people with fewer shifts if they speak up." Todd's voice was tight. "I was following directives." Daniel didn't let up. "Who told you to do this?" Todd hesitated. "Craig." Daniel's jaw tightened. Craig had assured him everything was running smoothly. But now the truth was staring him in the face. His voice was firm. "You're done here, Todd, effective immediately." Todd stiffened. "You can't be serious." Daniel didn't waver. "You've created a toxic environment and put my employees at risk. I won't let that continue." Todd's face darkened, but he didn't argue. He turned, heading toward the back office without another word. The silence in the kitchen was heavy. Daniel turned to Caleb. "You should never have been put in that position. That won't happen again." Caleb looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You really mean that?" Daniel nodded. "I do." Emily swallowed. "What happens now?" Daniel's voice was steady. "Now I make things right." Daniel stood in the middle of the restaurant, the tension still thick in the air after Todd's departure. Employees exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what to do next. The usual hum of the kitchen had quieted, the weight of the revelation still settling over them. Josh cleared his throat, breaking the silence. His voice was hesitant. "So, what happens now?" Daniel exhaled. He had come in to observe, but now that he had seen the reality of the situation, there was no going back to the office and pretending things were fine. "We're going to fix this," he said. "Starting now." Josh looked skeptical. "With all due respect, sir, we've heard things like that before. Every time we complain, we get told it'll be addressed, but nothing really changes." Daniel met his gaze. "That's why I came here myself. Because I needed to see what was really happening instead of relying on second-hand reports." Emily, who had been quiet since the reveal, finally spoke. "Does that mean we actually get more staff, or are we just supposed to keep pushing through?" Daniel turned to her. "You shouldn't have to push through like this. No one should. This isn't how a restaurant should be run." Caleb rubbed his hands together, still looking wary. "So what are you actually going to do?" Daniel didn't blame him for being doubtful. Trust wasn't built in a single moment. "It had to be earned. First, I'm bringing in more employees. Immediately, no more working short-staffed to save money." He glanced at Josh. "You said Todd was the one cutting shifts to reduce labor costs." Josh nodded. "Yeah. He kept saying we had to hit certain targets, so we were told to manage with as few people as possible." Daniel's jaw tensed. "That ends today." Emily shifted her weight. "And what about breaks?" "We're always told we can take them, but the second we try, we get guilted into staying." Daniel's eyes darkened at the thought. "Breaks aren't optional, they're required. And if managers are pressuring anyone to skip them, that's going to be dealt with." Caleb let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "I'll believe it when I see it." Daniel studied him. The kid had been pushed too far, and he wasn't going to be convinced with words alone. "You will," Daniel said. "Because I'm not leaving this location until I see things change firsthand." Josh frowned. "Wait, you mean now you're staying?" Daniel nodded. "Consider this my new office for the day." Emily blinked. "You're serious?" Daniel rolled up his sleeves. "I didn't come here to make promises and walk away. I came here to fix things." Josh looked like he was still processing it. "So what are we supposed to do?" Daniel glanced around. "Right now, we get through this shift, but from this moment forward, you're not running this place short-staffed." "I'll bring in backup myself if I have to." Josh hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's do this." The employees cautiously returned to work, but there was something different in the air now. It wasn't just another shift where they had to grind through exhaustion while management ignored their struggles. Someone was finally listening. Daniel jumped in, helping wherever he could. He took orders at the counter, filled drinks, and even stepped into the kitchen to assist with prep work. He wasn't here to just observe anymore, he was here to be part of the solution. As he worked alongside them, he saw the exhaustion in their movements, the way they constantly glanced at the clock, counting the minutes until relief arrived. By the time the dinner rush hit, Daniel had already made a call to pull employees from other locations to cover the gaps. When fresh workers arrived, the change was immediate. The tension eased, the pace became manageable, and employees finally caught their breath. Emily leaned against the counter, exhaling. "I forgot what it felt like to have help." Caleb, now sitting in the break area with an actual meal in front of him, shook his head. "This doesn't even feel real." Daniel sat across from him. "It should be the standard, not the exception." Caleb studied him for a long moment. "You really didn't know this was happening?" Daniel shook his head. "I trusted my managers to run things the right way. That trust was clearly misplaced." Caleb poked at his food. "You're the owner. Shouldn't you have caught this sooner?" Daniel didn't flinch at the question. "I should have, and that's on me. But I'm here now, and I'm not going to let this happen again." Caleb nodded slowly. "Guess we'll see." Daniel didn't take offense. He didn't expect immediate trust. But he would earn it. As the shift continued, Daniel made more calls. He reached out to corporate, ensuring policy changes would be implemented across all locations. He scheduled an emergency meeting with district managers, making it clear that things were changing. By the time closing time arrived, employees looked tired but not broken. It was the first step in a much larger process, but it was a start. As Daniel prepared to leave, Emily approached him. "Are you really going to follow through on all this?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze. "Yes. And if anyone tries to tell you otherwise, you call me directly." She stared at him for a moment, then nodded. "All right." Caleb crossed his arms. "Guess we'll hold you to that." Daniel smiled. "Good. That's exactly what I want." As he stepped out of the restaurant, he knew his work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly leading his company again, and he wasn't going to stop until every location reflected the standards he had built it on. Daniel arrived at the corporate office early the next morning, his mind already made up. He had seen firsthand how the system was failing, and now it was time to dismantle the structure that had allowed it to happen. He wasn't interested in excuses or justifications, only solutions. Craig was waiting for him in the conference room, looking confident as always. He had no idea what was coming. "I heard you made a surprise visit to one of my stores," Craig said, leaning back in his chair. "Would have been nice to give me a heads up." Daniel sat down, his expression unreadable. "Would it? Or would you have cleaned things up just long enough to fool me?" Craig stiffened slightly but forced a chuckle. "Come on, Daniel, I run a tight ship." "Sure, things get rough sometimes, but that's the business. Fast food is chaotic, you know that." Daniel let a long silence hang between them before speaking. A 16-year-old worked a full shift without a break. He was told if he clocked out, he'd lose hours next week. A teenage girl was berated in the middle of a rush for struggling to keep up. And one of your district managers, Todd, was the one enforcing these conditions. Craig's jaw tightened. "I trust my managers to make the right calls. You know how labor costs work, we have to be smart about scheduling." Daniel's voice was ice. "Smart? You call that smart? Cutting so many shifts that the remaining employees are running themselves into the ground, letting managers threaten teenagers into staying longer than they legally should." "That's not smart, Craig, that's negligence." Craig sat forward, his confidence cracking. "Look, I get that you're upset, but let's be real here. These kids exaggerate. They complain about working hard, but that's just how it is. We're not running a charity, we're running a business." Daniel's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. "That's the last time I'm going to hear you say that. This isn't about charity. It's about running a company that doesn't grind its employees into the ground and then discard them. You knew this was happening and you let it continue." Craig sighed, shaking his head. "What do you want, Daniel? An apology? Fine, I'm sorry if things got a little rough out there. I'll talk to Todd, make some adjustments, and we'll smooth things over. No need to overreact." Daniel's stare was unyielding. "You're done here, Craig." Craig blinked. "What? I'm firing you, effective immediately." Craig let out a short laugh, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "You can't be serious." Daniel's tone didn't shift. "You've allowed a culture of fear and overwork to spread through this company. You lied to me repeatedly about how things were running, and worst of all, you stood here just now and acted like none of it mattered." Craig leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You fire me and you'll have a mess on your hands. I know this business inside and out." Daniel met his gaze without hesitation. "Then I'll clean up the mess you made." Craig sat in stunned silence before finally pushing back from the table. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. "You're making a mistake," he said. Daniel didn't bother responding. Craig wasn't worth another second of his time. Once Craig left, Daniel wasted no time. He called a company-wide meeting with every district manager and supervisor. When they arrived, they found him standing at the front of the room, waiting. The atmosphere was different this time. There was no small talk, no casual greetings. Everyone knew something was coming. "I went undercover yesterday," Daniel said simply. "I worked a full shift in one of our busiest locations. What I saw was unacceptable." The room was silent, managers exchanging wary glances. "I saw employees pushed past their limits. I saw shifts deliberately understaffed to save money. I saw people afraid to take breaks because they knew they'd be punished for it later. This isn't a one-location problem. This is systemic. And it ends today. A middle-aged manager hesitated before speaking. Sir, we've always been told to keep labor costs as low as possible. That's how Craig wanted it. Craig is no longer with this company, Daniel stated. And if any of you share his mindset, you won't be here much longer either. Murmurs spread through the room. A younger manager raised a hand. What exactly is changing? Everything, Daniel said. Effective immediately, every location will be fully staffed, no more cutting shifts to save money. Breaks are mandatory. If I hear about a single employee being denied one, the responsible manager will be fired on the spot. And if I find out that anyone is using hours as a form of punishment, they're gone. A woman near the front nodded slowly. Honestly. That's overdue. Daniel scanned the room. If you have concerns, now is the time to bring them up. A manager toward the back shifted uncomfortably. With respect, sir, this is going to cost money, a lot of it. Daniel nodded. Yes, and that's an investment, not a loss. A burned-out workforce leads to higher turnover, lower performance, and declining customer experience. If we take care of our people, they'll take care of the business. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then, gradually, heads began to nod. Daniel made sure the changes were enacted immediately. New hiring initiatives were launched. Employee surveys were introduced to allow anonymous reporting of workplace conditions. Regional supervisors were assigned to visit stores unannounced to ensure compliance. Over the next several weeks, the impact was undeniable. Customer service ratings improved, employee retention rates stabilized, and perhaps most importantly, the culture began to shift. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by the same restaurant where it had all started. Caleb was at the counter, looking far more rested than the last time they'd spoken. Emily was working the fryer, but this time there was no panic in her movements. There were more employees on the floor, and the energy felt different. Caleb noticed him and approached cautiously. Didn't think you'd actually follow through, Daniel smiled slightly. I said I would, didn't I? Caleb considered that, then nodded. Yeah, you did. Emily wiped her hands on a towel as she walked over. It's better now, way better. Daniel glanced around. That's how it should have been from the start. Caleb folded his arms, studying him. So, what happens if things slip again? Daniel's expression hardened slightly. They won't. Because this time, I'm watching. For the first time since they'd met, Caleb looked genuinely satisfied with the answer. Daniel leaned against the counter, taking in the restaurant's new rhythm. The employees moved with more ease, the tension that once hung in the air noticeably absent. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was progress. Caleb wiped his hands on his apron and narrowed his eyes slightly. This time there was no skepticism, just curiosity. Not gonna lie, he said. I figured you'd come in here, make some big speech, and disappear back to corporate. Daniel crossed his arms. That's what most CEOs would do, right? Emily, stepping away from the fryer for a moment, nodded. Pretty much. We've had corporate people visit before. They smile, take notes, and nothing changes. Daniel didn't look away. That's why I had to see it myself. If I hadn't, I might have believed Craig's version of things. Caleb tilted his head slightly. So, what about the other locations? You only saw this one firsthand. Daniel pushed off the counter. That's why I've been visiting them, unannounced, talking to employees, watching how shifts run. Each store has its own problems, but the pattern was the same. And it all led back to the kind of management Craig put in place. Emily exhaled, glancing toward the kitchen. So, what happens to the managers who were like Todd? Daniel's expression didn't shift. They're gone. Anyone who mistreated employees, ignored labor laws, or created a toxic work environment isn't part of this company anymore. Caleb's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't say anything right away. Josh, the shift manager, walked over, wiping his hands on a towel. I was worried when you fired Craig, thought we'd be left scrambling. Daniel met his gaze. And? Josh shook his head. Turns out not having someone breathing down our necks about cutting labor made everything easier. We actually have the right number of people on shift now. Daniel nodded. That's how it should be. Josh hesitated, then glanced toward the back. We lost some people, the ones who thrived under Todd's rules. They weren't happy about the changes. Daniel expected as much. Some managers only work well in broken systems. When you fix the system, they can't adapt. Emily crossed her arms. Good riddance. Josh chuckled under his breath. Yeah, that's about how most of the staff felt. Daniel studied him. How's the team handling everything? Josh considered the question before answering. Better morale for sure. People aren't scared to call out if they're sick. No one's getting guilted into skipping breaks. It's still fast food, still stressful, but it's not miserable anymore. Daniel glanced at Emily and Caleb. That match with your experience? Emily nodded. Yeah. It actually feels like a job now, not a punishment. Caleb leaned against the counter. Still don't love the uniform, though. Daniel let out a rare laugh. Noted. Josh rubbed the back of his neck. I gotta ask, though, what happens long term? You're here now, but once things settle, how do we know it won't slide back to how it was before? Daniel met his gaze. Because I'm not making these changes alone. I put new oversight in place. Regional supervisors who actually visit stores, not just look at spreadsheets. Anonymous reporting systems for employees, and I expect people like you to speak up if things start slipping. Josh nodded slowly. All right, that's fair. Caleb tapped his fingers against the counter. You really think all of this is enough? Daniel's expression hardened slightly. It has to be. Caleb considered that for a moment, then nodded. Guess we'll see. Daniel knew trust wasn't rebuilt overnight. But standing in that restaurant, seeing the difference already taking shape, he also knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let his company fall back into the same failures. This wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about making sure it never broke again.